In this section of the tutorial workshop, we'll go over the ideation of creating the mechs for our scene. These are looks like about 15 mechs that I've created, and these were mostly done at CTN when I had some downtime and was not talking to people. Each one of these took about maybe 10 or 15 minutes to do, and what we're going to do is do the next 5, and at the end we're going to have about 20 of them, and we'll choose which ones we want. Based on my working with Scott on this project, we determined that the first one is going to be our hero mech. So this one right here is going to be our hero mech, and the rest of these, we will choose some of them to be mechs that were destroyed in the story, and this will be our last mech standing. So as you can see here, I've got a variety of different mechs, and all of these have been created again in 10 or 15 minutes, and this is kind of similar to when we do thumbnails when we work in Photoshop or in pen and ink. So we basically create a bunch of thumbnails and then pick which ones we're going to develop further. Okay, so without further ado, let's go ahead and get started on the next 5. So the first thing we're going to do is go ahead and create or append a poly mesh to the scene, and as you can see here, it's in the middle. And by the way, all of these other mechs are in the middle as well. I've just basically used expose to bring them all out. So right now what I'm going to do is just focus on the new poly mesh that I added, and click on solo to make that the only visible mesh. So the rest of these mechs are still there, but I've just selected this one and chosen to hide the rest. And what we're going to do here is we're going to initialize this as a cube. So in the tool menu, we'll go to the bottom to initialize and choose QCube. However, before we do that, we need to make sure that the resolution is at 1 for X, Y, and Z. So X, Y, and Z are at 1. Click on QCube, and here is our cube. And as we can see, our cube has different colors on it, and that indicates different polygroups, meaning each one of these has a grouping of its own, and we can interact with specific groups instead of the whole model. So now that I've got this cube, the next thing I want to do is go ahead and replicate that another 4 times, because we're going to have 4 of these cubes that we're going to, or 5 of these cubes we're going to work on to develop into mechs. So we'll just select that cube again, go to duplicate, and we are at 5. So we've got 5 of these cubes, and we're going to go ahead and get started with this one right here. Okay. So first thing we want to do is also another concept I want to talk about real quick is that when you saw the rest of the mechs, and I'll bring them up again, so I'll go back to solo and break them out, we can see that these have curved shapes to them, and they're not very stiff, solid, hard surface, but in actuality they are. So if I bring up any one of these mechs, and I'll choose this one right here, and if I look at this one mech, it is in dynamic subdivision form. So what that means is that I've turned on dynamic subdivision, and that is done under geometry and dynamic subdiv, and as you can see here, it is turned on. If I turn that off, you'll notice that my model is more hard surface looking, more angular, and I can choose any one of these. I can choose this model to be more like this, where the edges are sharp, or if I turn dynamic on, then my model is more kind of organic looking and has curved surfaces. And if I turn QGrid on here, I can go anywhere in between and choose more of a beveled look, like so. And so now I'm kind of going in between the really curved look and the really hard surface, hard angle look, and I can choose anything in between these two. And the great thing about this is also that the polygon count here is pretty low, so I can really get a really compelling look going without making it very high poly, and So the primary form is established very quickly, and then from these 20 primary forms, I will go ahead and pick out the one that I like most to be the hero, which we've already done, which is this one. And then for the rest of them, what we will do is pick another few of those and then have those be in the scene in a more destroyed manner. Alright, so with that done, let's go back to our cube here and let's go ahead and collapse everything back down. And go to solo mode, where we're just going to work on that one cube and start building a mech out of it. So the brush I'm going to use for this is the ZModeler brush, and I'm going to go ahead and double click on the edge here to bring up this menu, and I also want to dock my brush menu over to the left. I'm using the default or the standard user interface for ZBrush for this because that's the one you have. I usually work with a custom user interface, which is ever evolving, and but I will use the standard interface so that when you load up ZBrush, you will see the same thing that I do. You might not have as many brushes here as I do in yours, but I've collected brushes over the years, and so that's why my brush menus might look a little bit bigger than what you might see when you load ZBrush up. But as you work further on in ZBrush, you'll get a bunch of brushes as well, and probably have as big of a brush menu. So to choose the brush we want, it is this one right here, ZModeler. And another quick way of choosing it is just to click on this brush menu and choose it from this menu here. And as you can see, there's a lot of brushes. It might take you a while to find the specific one you need. So you can also use keystrokes to speed that up. So B for brush, Z for ZModeler, and you can see here that ZModeler has the letter M next to it, so it's BZM. And from this point forward, if I hit BZM on the keyboard in succession, the ZModeler brush will be activated. One other thing I want to do is I want to make sure that my mech is symmetric because I want to just model the thing on one side and have it generate the model for me on the other. So for that, what I will do is go to the transform menu here and activate symmetry. So transform, activate symmetry, and what I want to make sure is just X is selected, not Y or Z. And also M is selected for mirroring of the symmetry. And to find out which one I need, if I bring up the floor here, I'll notice on the floor that X is pointing this way, Z is pointing this way, Z is blue, X is red, Y is green. And so this direction is where I want the symmetry to occur. So when I QMesh, and I'll talk about what that is in a minute, that this side will be mirrored on this side, and the center line is where this axis is. Okay, so let's hide the floor to remove as many distractions as we can, and let's talk about the ZModeler brush. So the ZModeler brush allows you to do modeling on a surface, and by holding down the spacebar you get a bunch of different commands, and these commands can be for a polygon. So when you're on a face, it's a polygon command. When you're on an edge, it's a edge command, and when you're on a vertex, it's a vertex command. So as you're on the object, whatever you're on, when you hit spacebar, you'll get a menu and you'll get options to do things to that surface, the polygon or the edge or the vertex. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to use the QMesh function, which is the default one. So that's what you start out with, and we're just going to leave everything as default here as well. And as I point to a surface and pull out, I will start creating the shape of my mech. So I don't really have any idea of what kind of mech I'm going to create. I'm trying to do something different than the ones that I have. So I'm just going to go ahead and just click, and I notice that as I pull to in the X direction, things start building up in that direction, and as I pull in the Y or Z direction, so this is Z, and or actually I'm sorry, this is Y and this is Z, things will grow out that way. Now to get this into that curved look, the dynamic look, I can press D on my keyboard or go back to the menu of geometry, dynamic subdiv, and click on dynamic. So I could either do that or press the D key. If I press the D key, this dialog box comes up and says, do you want to do this all the time? I usually say always yes. And now I can hit D to get this curved look and shift D to get back to the hard look. And again, I can go in here and pick something in between. I usually model in one or the other. So this time I'm just going to go ahead and model in the more of the smooth look of my model. So here I'm going to start building up again QMesh, and I'm trying again to get something that I don't already have as a shape from what I've worked on before. So I'm going to say this is the body and start building out the legs. So this is going to be where the legs are going to come out from. And I want the legs to be separate from the body of the mech, and the arms are going to be here. So to separate it out, so notice when you Q mesh, you pull out that shape, but if you hold Control down, it actually pulls out that piece. So right now I've just pulled out that face, and it's separate from the body. So now it's its own separate piece, and then I can Q-mesh that and start building out the leg from that area. So I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit of thickness here. It's going to be tricky because it's going to want to reconnect with the body, but maybe I can, if I can just do a more subtle touch like that, I can get that harder edge, and here I'll do that as well. And I'm going to grow out the leg out this way, and then down, and as you can see very quickly I'm able to build out the shape, and build down again one more time and one more time to get kind of more of a straight edge. So these are the legs of the mech, and that's the body, and it's of course looking pretty boring right now, but we're going to do some things to it to make it look more interesting in a minute. So maybe build out this way, build out this way, and just from a balance perspective, again, this is the front of it, so I'm trying to get it to balance out, and maybe these would be legs as well. And so I'm going to pull that out this way, and again hold Control to get the shape to pop out, and then do this and get more of a shape like that, and maybe we can grow out another leg that goes down this way, or an arm. That's a bit too much. Again, these are really quick and easy ways of creating these shapes, and very analogous to doing silhouettes when working in 2D in Photoshop or in another program. Now what I also want to do here is I want to make sure that this is straight across on the bottom, and to do that I'm going to go off of perspective mode here, so not be in perspective mode, be in orthogonal mode, and then go ahead and use the clip capability in ZBrush. So Control Shift, when we hold those two down and click on the brush here, we get a selection of different brushes, and I'm going to choose this clip rectangle brush. So clip rect, and then just do Shift Control and click, and that will straighten out that bottom edge so the legs are on the same elevation. Okay, that looks pretty good for now, and now what I want to do is get away from this boring horizontal and vertical look. So what we'll do is go to another brush, which is the Move brush, and I'm going to choose that from my brush palette here, but again you can always go in here and so B for brush again, M for move, and then whatever letter is on the move brush. In my case it's B, in your case it could be V, and just click on that button, and that will actually bring you the move brush as a tool to use. Now the next thing I'm going to do is press the S key and change the size of my brush, the draw size. I can also do that up here, and I can also hit spacebar and choose the draw size. So there's three different ways of choosing the draw size. I like using S because it's a smaller footprint and I can easily change the size of the brush, and this basically is the size that will affect the model. So if I choose a bigger brush size, then I'll be affecting more of the model, and I'll show you how that is. So I'm affecting more of the model, and if I choose a smaller brush size, I'll be affecting a lot less of it. If you're an experienced ZBrush user, all of these are pretty standard things that you use all the time, but I'm assuming since I'm doing this article for ImagineFX, some of you might be new to ZBrush and new to 3D, so want to explain things as I go. So if you're an experienced ZBrush user, you might want to pardon my going through every step, And if you're a new user, hopefully this is useful for you and you can get started doing some interesting things with ZBrush pretty quickly. All right, so now I'm just giving this a bit of a gesture here and trying to figure out an interesting shape for the hull, and maybe something like this. And again, if I hit Shift D, this is what I'm manipulating, and this might be looking more interesting in this rectangular straight-edged form, but I can always go back and forth between the two to pick the one I want. And this looks pretty interesting right here. So a lot of times, you could be working on these back and forth to get them to appear the way you like, and sometimes you get lucky and you get an interesting form right away. And in this case, it looks like I'm pretty happy with it. So there's one more thing I want to do, and that is to look at this in silhouette form. So I talked about that earlier, where I mentioned drawing in silhouette form in ZBrush, in Photoshop or ink and paper, and doing ideation that way. So let's go ahead and see what that would look like in ZBrush. So to get this into a silhouette looking form, what we will do is go here to the material and choose flat color as our material. So when we choose flat color as our material, that will show us our model in a flat color. It's still showing us the polygroups, and if I want to turn that off and turn off the edges here, if I click on this poly F button, now I basically only see that silhouette. So I also want to make sure that my silhouette is compelling looking, so I can still come in here and sculpt just in silhouette mode. So imagine you draw a silhouette and you're happy with it, but there's certain things you want to change. In Photoshop, it might be easy to do that, or but in pen and paper you might have to draw another image. So here we're very easily going in and creating maybe more of a compelling look. And even though my model looked good with the grid lines on, and I like the way it looks from the front, but from the side maybe I can do certain things to make it look more interesting there. That, sweeping that leg back made it look more interesting, and maybe move this shape like that and create more of a interesting and compelling silhouette that is balanced and good to go. And I can also, what's really nice here is I could look at that silhouette in all 360 view and see what it looks like, and I like it. So I'm going to go back to my initial material that I had, which was Skin Shade 4, and there it is, and also turn polyframe back on. One thing I should note is that these pins that are sticking out of the model, that you might be curious as to what those are, those actually are the vertices, right? So if I go back to Shift D, you notice that that's that vertex, and now that vertex isn't there. So it shows me where that vertex is, or if you think of this as a Bezier curve, this would be like a control point, and you can actually move this these vertices around to change the shape of your model. So I think I'm going to go for this as my look here, and I think I'm pretty happy with this one. So I've got one more done, and I got another 4 to go. I don't know if I'm going to narrate those 4 that are left, but I will maybe model them and speed up the video so you can follow along. I'm basically doing the same things I did for this one. I'm just doing them differently to get a different shape. So we'll start with this one. Okay, so we're done with our 15 different mechs, and let's go ahead and bring them all up. One of the things that you notice here is that the new ones that I did don't fit into that same space that the other ones were in. And to do that, we have to do one last step. And I'll start with, I think this one is the one we started with. And to get it into that same area, same space, again, these are of different scales, but for now I just want them to fit in the same space. And for that, what we'll do is we'll just go into the deformation menu, so Tool, Deformation. And under Deformation, we'll choose the first option here, make sure X, Y, and Z is on, and click on Unify, and that will place, let me turn transparency on so you can see it, that will place that mech in the same space as the other ones. And I can start just working down that list of new mechs that I made, and for each one I'll just click on Unify, click on the next one, click Unify, and again they're all going to eventually fit into that same space that I had. And so now we have them all in that same space. Turn transparency off. And now if I click on Expose again, here are my 20 mechs. And I'll just go ahead and render them real quick. So this is looking at them from the front view, and if I just click on BPR, I think this one is facing backwards. I'll just go ahead and fix it, which is a good opportunity for me to talk about how that's done. I did it, I think, in one of the different mechs that I was making, so I can show you how that's done. And also I want to make sure that this one right here is back in the dynamic subdiv mode, so back to smooth mode, and this is the one right here that is pointing backwards, and I want it to point forwards, and I think this one's pointing backwards too, so I'll do it for both. So to bring those to the front, one thing I want to do here is click on the W, which is the gizmo, and let's move all these back to the center and solo that specific mech out. There it is, and the gizmo is at the center, and what I want to do is rotate it, and the rotation is going to be along the y-axis, which is this green line right here, and I want to rotate it. And I also want to lock the rotation, so right now it's just rotating arbitrarily. If I hold my shift key down, I will rotate it at 90-degree intervals, and I want that to go to 180 and let go. So now this is pointing forwards. And I'll go ahead and pick this mech right here. Sometimes you'll notice that the gizmo is not centered on the mech, especially if you have symmetry turned on, so you can just go ahead and turn symmetry back off by clicking this. And then if you hold the Alt key down and click on this icon right here, it will center the gizmo on the mesh itself. Another good idea is to click this one, which will set the gizmo back to its default location. And then again, hold Shift down and rotate this so it's 180 degrees, so it's pointing forward like so. Okay, so now let's take a look at the rest of the meshes and expose this back out. So now I'm happy with what my result is, and all of the meshes are pointing in the right direction. Do a click BPR render, and these are the selection of meshes that I have, of mechs that I have, sorry. And what I need to do now is pick the ones that I will use. Obviously the first one's going to be the hero mech, and we're going to definitely use this one, but also we are going to choose one of these, a few of these to be strewn about the scene as fodder or mechs that have been defeated in the big battle. So with that, this is the end of this section, and we will move on to the next one. In this section of the workshop, we'll talk about array mesh and how to create interesting looking buildings. And to start off, I just wanted to mention that just like we created the mechs, I've created a bunch of really simple geometry to indicate these buildings. And again, they're all in one file, which I've loaded into a brush, and I will show you in in the next video how to use that brush to populate your scene. But in this video, we're just going to concentrate on using array mesh to create these floors and continuing shapes, which can very easily be done by using a simple function in ZBrush. So these buildings are, again, very simple shapes that I've done some work with. Some of them are a little bit more sophisticated, like this one, for example, over here, where I've spent some time and used some of the new Boolean functions in ZBrush to get some of these cut-ins and these shapes that kind of are cutting into this spire over here. And also I've used it to combine some of these floors to some of these buildings. Some of them I haven't, but you don't really have to use booleans if you don't want to. You can get these shapes pretty simply by modeling in the same way that I modeled the mechs earlier. Okay, so to get one of these buildings, we'll just go ahead and start up a new building. So I'm just going to go ahead and start out with a new polymesh like so. And just like before, we'll just go ahead and initialize it. And this time I'm just going to leave it as it is with resolution 2 and 2 and 2. And this is what my cube looks like. And I'm going to make a really simple building. So I'm going to go to the ZModeler brush here. So right there. And ZModeler right here. And again, I'm going to be using the QMesh functionality and just going ahead and taking this part up like this, and maybe make this an interesting building. Maybe there's a part that's like this, or maybe I'll just pull this whole part out. So in order to pull all these faces out at once, I'm going to just go ahead and QMesh, but I'm going to do it on a polygroup island. So it's just going to take out all of these. And so this is the first part of the building, which is this little part. And then I'm going to QMesh these, not all four, but maybe flat and polygroup, and pull these up like this. So this is going to be my building, and to make it a little bit more interesting here, I'm going to go ahead and go into my move. So again, B, M, and then B here, and it could be V for you, and choose a brush size that's a little bit bigger like so, and maybe make this an interesting building where these faces go in a little bit like that, like so. So this is going to be the facade of the building. And what I want to do here is create some floors, right? So I'm going to have some floors in here that will indicate how many stories this building is. So to do that, I'll just go ahead and go into my subtool menu and append another polymesh 3D. And I'll go ahead and take this polymesh 3D and initialize it again, this time a Q cube of 1, 1, and 1. Or to make it interesting, maybe we can use a Q cylinder. Maybe I'll do that. Let's do a Q cylinder. It might be a little bit more interesting. So Q cylinder in Y. So we'll change the Z and the X to 2 and keep our Y at 1 and do a Q cyl Y. So now I've got a cylinder. It's inside here. We can't see it. And if I turn transparency on, you can see it's inside there, but that's fine. And then by pressing W or going to the move tool up here, we'll go ahead and change this to be a little bit flatter and also to be a little bit wider. And to do that, we'll just use this middle scale button and then scale it down like so. And maybe scale it down to about here, and maybe we'll just go ahead and put it at the bottom where we want our first floor to be. So this is going to be our first floor, right? And we're going to want to have more of these going up. Now, of course, I can always duplicate this cylinder. I'm going to turn transparency off here. I can always duplicate the cylinder and place them, but there's a much easier way to do it, and that's by using array mesh. Let me turn on the floor 2 here so you can kind of see the ground. So there's my building. This is kind of the skeleton of it, and then what we're going to do is we're going to build up these floors. So to do that, I'll go ahead in my tool menu here, go to array mesh, and turn array mesh on. So once I turn that on, all these controls become visible, and once they are visible, what I will do next is go ahead and say how many floors I want. So let's start out with 10 floors. So I'm going to just type in the number 10 here under repeat. That tells me how many of these I want. And the next thing here is I'm going to be choosing offset and choosing what direction they go in. So right now, let's see, it's the Y direction. And let's see if we go up in this way positively, it goes downward. So we want to go the other way. So we'll go up at negative Y. And as you see on my screen here, it is adding my floors. And there they are. So there are my 10 floors. And if I don't like that shape, if I want these floors to be thinner, for example, if I change my original one, the other ones will change too. So now that this is thinner, I might want to have 20 floors. So I can just go in here and tap 20. Now I've got 20 floors, and then I can still move this Y amount up to create those 20 floors. And there is my 20 floor building. Now the other thing also is that this is kind of going in, so the floors maybe don't need to be the same size. And with that, I can go to scale here and also start changing the X and Y scale to make the scale smaller. So here I can make the scale smaller in X, and I can change this, make the scale smaller in Z. And that does that, and I can move my original one, which moves the whole stack. And here is my interesting looking building. Of course, I can always make some changes to it. So if I wanted to kind of protrude out this way, move it up over here, and rotate it at a certain angle. I'm just going to keep them straight because I don't want the people to slide off. And just keep it this way. And I think I'm liking this. Maybe make it a little bit smaller on the top. So again, bring that in. And I think this should do it. And of course you can do a lot more sophisticated things here with changing the shape of this. I'm just going to very simply do this kind of because if you've never used ZBrush before, you've never used Array Mesh, it has very powerful capabilities. So that's this part of it. And again, you can play around with rotate, so that's kind of fun too. If I want to rotate these floors, like give them a little bit of a kind of a rotation like this to make it more interesting, and that actually turned out pretty neat. And go back to offset here, maybe make that scale a little bit bigger. Like so. And here we go. I think this is going to do it for me for this building. I like the way it looks, and just go ahead and accept it. Now, once you're happy with what you've done and you don't want to make any changes to it, because notice here I can still make changes. If I don't want to make any changes to it and I'm happy with it, I can just say make mesh, and now this has created a single mesh for me. One of the things you'll notice here is that ZBrush connected all these together, and if I didn't want that, so Control Z or undo will undo your operation. And if I didn't want these to be connected, notice that there's this extrude button here that's checked. That will connect them up. If you don't want them connected, check that off and then click on Make Mesh. And here are my floors created very quickly and interesting way. And now I'm happy with this. I'll just go to my subtool menu and notice that these are two different subtools, and if I want them to be connected, I can just go ahead and click on merge down. So I'll click on the top one, click on merge down, okay, and now this is one building, right? And I can still go in and make changes to it. So if I wanted to, again, let me expand this out over here on the right and place my brush menu here so I can quickly select the brushes that I want. And if I want to go to my Z modeler again, I can still pull this out like so, maybe pull this out like so over here, or maybe just QMesh one polygon here, single poly, pull this one out and this one out like that. So here is kind of another interesting building that I've created, and I can add that to my list of buildings. So now that you look at the buildings that I made, these 20 buildings over here, you get an idea of how that came to be. So let me expand them out. So you can see that with this one, for example, all I did is that exact same thing. I just made a shape and then extruded it out. This one I did not add floors to, which is fine because I wanted this to be more of a background building, and all these have floors added to them. And again, with Booleans, you can subtract those shapes out of these buildings as well. So you can see here, I've made this one just by changing the curve of the way array mesh goes up. And there are some really good tutorials on array mesh on ZBrush Central, and it is a very nice tool to use to make repeated shapes in certain directions, and it really helped me make these buildings very quickly and efficiently. In this video, we'll go ahead and talk about how to place our different assets onto the scene to make the composition. So first, before that though, I just wanted to mention that one of the mechs, our hero mech here, is in the form I wanted to get it to. So this is in secondary detail form, and again, if I turn dynamic subdivision on by pressing D, I will get it to look more along the lines of what we intended it to look like. So this is the mech that's going to be closest to us, and it is the hero mech, so it is going to be the one that has a little bit more detail on it. If I were to develop this further into 3D and render it in a 3D program, I would probably be adding tertiary forms to it, things like cut-ins, and screw holes and bolts, and maybe develop the guns better or whatever. Maybe put some detail here, springs and whatnot, into the legs to give it more of a mechanical look. But for now, all I need is just the secondary form developed from the primary form that we started out with. So I just want to mention that I've got that as a tool over here, and I also have my 20 buildings. And we're going to go ahead and get into the part of setting these up into our scene. So before I do that though, I need to go ahead and let me start out with a blank tool. So I'm just going to go ahead and bring up a Polymesh 3D here, and in my initialize option here, instead of choosing a cube or a sphere or a cylinder, I'm just going to go ahead and choose a Q grid. And notice that it's a 2x2 grid like so, and I want to actually bump up that resolution to maybe about 40 by 40, and there are different ways of doing this, but I'm just going to do it this way. So 40x and 40z, and Q grid again. I think I mistyped. Maybe y needs to be 40 here. And because it's going up, I'm just going to rotate it in a minute. So there is my plane, and of course I want this plane to be facing upward, so I just go to click on W for my move tool, and if I rotate this without notice that I get arbitrary angles shown at the bottom here, and that's not what I want. I want to actually lock it in, so I'm just going to hold the shift key, so that shift key will snap it at 5-degree angles, and until I get to 90, and there it is. So as I move, the floor will snap to it, and this is going to be basically my ground on which I'm going to be placing the objects. Before I do that though, I also need to set up my scene here. And to do that, I'm going to do a few things. First thing I'm going to do is make sure floor is on. So, and floor is on in Y. I can also turn it on in X and Z here if I needed to. But I don't need the X and Z, I just need the Y for now. And also I want to make sure local is off so that I can work on this as a scene and not a specific object. Local will change the transformations locally to a specific object, and that's not what I want. Specifically not for laying out the scene. I mean, when I'm working on a specific object, I do need this on. The other things I want to do here is in my draw menu, which I've docked over here to my left, I want to make sure perspective is on, which is also here. And my angle of view, this is something that I can change, and angle of view kind of talks about the angle within which you look. I think 50 corresponds to about 25 degrees if you were looking at it from a DSLR lens perspective, and I would recommend going anywhere between 20 and 60 on this, and you can always change that to make your composition look more dramatic. I'm going to leave it at the default of 50 for now, and I want to make sure that align to object is off and auto adjust distance is off. Okay, so we need to make sure these two are off so that we will get more of a scene composition versus working on a specific model in the middle. And then the next thing we're going to do here is go to grid size and change that to be 100. And change the tiles to be 100 as well. That way, when we look into the horizon here, we will see that our grid goes all the way out to the horizon. I think I need my tiles to be 100 as well. Grid size 200. So when I place it down like this, you can kind of see that I already have a scene started, and in the middle of the scene is my plane, which I will make bigger now to so that I have enough room for it to kind of go all the way to my vanishing point, which is this line over here. And I don't need to exactly have it be at the vanishing point, but I will make it up to be about this big. Right, so now I've got my floor established, and I've got all my settings ready to go. The next thing I want to do here, and this is an important power tip, is to turn on something that will allow me to snap to a specific view. So to do that, I'm going to go into the movie menu over here and timeline and turn that on. So click on show here, and that brings up this timeline. And what this will do is it will, if you click on the actual tick marks here, it will put a dot there, which indicates to me that that vantage point is saved. So let's say this is a vantage point I want saved right here. So I want to be able to return to this camera view, so to speak, at any point in time. So to do that, I'll just go ahead and pop in a point right here. Okay, so now if I move around, if I just move my timeline, it will snap to that view. Another good one to have is looking top down and my entire scene. So here's another view I want to keep. So I'll just put a dot over here arbitrarily, and that will snap this view. So now I can go between this view that I had to this view. We're looking at from the top. Another good one to have is to look at it from the side like this. And for that, usually I turn perspective off, but that's fine. I'll just go ahead and set up a view. So now I've got one view, that's the side, one view, that's the top. So if I just bring my cursor over to here, I'll look at it from the top, and another one that is going to be looking at it head on. Okay, so now that I've got that, I'll go back to my top view, and for this I'm going to turn perspective off, and then I'm going to go into my buildings here. So here are my different buildings that I had earlier. And from the subtools, I'll choose one of them. How about I'll choose the spire. So we'll start out with this spire here. I'll just select it, right? And go to copy. And then go to my Polymesh 3D here, which is my floor, right? And click on paste. So now I've got one of those spires on this building. So I'll just click on W here, and notice that on the spire, the move is centered at the origin, and I actually want it centered on the spire itself. So if you hold Alt down and click on this little placement button over here next to the home, that actually will place it on the spire itself. So now I can just move that spire and scale it to whatever, oops, not rotate, but scale it to whatever size I want. So I want it to be that size, and I want it to be on the floor here. And let's go to my view looking at it from this perspective, turn perspective on, and there it is kind of in the center. So if I want it to be in the center of my composition, I can see it. So there's one thing placed, and then I can go into the buildings over here and choose another one of these buildings. So let's say I want let's pick another one that's kind of interesting looking. Let's say I want this pyramid looking one, so select that one, copy it, go back to my composition here, and paste. Same drill, press W and resize it, and also make sure that it's centered on the object itself. And then we'll move it up. And notice the floor jumps to whatever the lowest point is, which is fine. Oops. And the reason why this is happening, if it happens with you, is because I've got symmetry turned on. So to turn symmetry off, I'll just go to transform and turn symmetry off. So you're just basically moving it this way. and place this where you want it to be. And again, I can just always jump to my initial view here and rotate this. And suppose I want this building to be right here. And again, of course, I can make this bigger if it's going to be a bigger building and place it wherever I want and move it around. And as you can see, you can very easily start putting in a composition together. Now, instead of going into the subtools and choosing the buildings, what I've done is I've provided for ImagineFX 2 insert mesh brushes that have all the brushes, all the buildings and all the mechs in it. So that makes your life a lot easier. You don't have to copy and paste. You can just go to the brush here and load the brush, and there are 2 of them. One of them is buildings and one of them is mechs. So here are the ones that are the buildings. So if you just choose that brush as a brush, it would load all your buildings in. And usually this is on the top, but if I have that on the top and the timeline on the top, it'll leave me very little room to work with. So in the preferences, I've docked these on the side. So here I can choose whatever building I want. So let's say I want one of these buildings, and then I can just go to my plane here, and once I've chosen that building, I can just draw that building out. And not only can I draw it out, but I can also change the aspect ratio if I want it to be thinner or thicker. And there it is. And once it's placed, I can click on W and rotate it and move it to anywhere I want, keep scaling it up. And what's nice is the way I have these set up is that when you scale them, it scales from the bottom on up. So once you've placed them on the floor, you just make them bigger. So here's one building. And then a good thing to do is, if you want to separate that out from the ground plane, is to go into Split and click on Split Unmasked Points. So now that's placed there, but I'm still on this floor here. And then I can choose a different building, let's say this one, and then just go in here and I just placed one of those buildings down. So I can just move that building over to here, like so, rotate it, scale it up or down, right? And again, if I want to see what this looks like from my vantage point, so I can see that these 2 buildings are not really showing up. So I can either in this view go and change them, or I can go to the top view here and move these within a visible point of what I can't see. So I can just move this around like so, and pick the other building and maybe move it in the back. Oops. Over here, rotate it this way, etc., and just arrange them until I get a composition that I like. So just like we have these buildings, I also have the mechs. So if you want to load the mechs in, you can just go ahead and click on this mechs IMM, mechs 01 IMM, and then here all the mechs are loaded. So if I want this mech, for example, I'll just go over to my plane. Make sure that I'm not on the building, but I'm actually on the plane itself. Oh, I forgot to separate these out, so it doesn't matter. And then I can just, let's see, in this one, go ahead and just, I guess I got rid of my plane. That's fine. I'll just go ahead and add another one. So here's Polymesh 3D, initialize, and QGrid. Rotate it 90 degrees, make it bigger. And once I'm happy with that, just go ahead and choose my mech again and place it down. Well, it's super, super big. I don't want it to be that big. And then let's go and look at our view here and see where it is compared to, oh, I did not add that to my existing scene, which is okay. I just need to append it right here. Okay, so there's the mech. It's kind of big. What I want to do is make it a bit smaller, like so, and then I can move that to a place in the scene as well. This is one of the ones that is going to be destroyed, so I can kind of rotate it, and I can also use my move brush to give it some damage as well. And just pull some of these points, just kind of give it a little bit of a more of a damaged look. And let's choose a bigger draw size here, like so. And just, if it's damaged, then the pieces are falling apart. Maybe one of these legs is out this way, and just create a more damaged look. So to choose some other mechs to place on here, and while I'm thinking about it, let me make sure I do this right this time. So go ahead and append a Polymesh 3D, select that one, initialize it as a Q grid, press W and rotate it. Of course, I'd be giving it more resolution and whatnot, but just for the sake of this demo, I'm just going to create a simple one, make it bigger, like so, and then go back and choose my mech brush. And I can place some of the other mechs, so I'll just go ahead and pick my hero mech here that was in its primary form and place that. Turn dynamic subdivision on for it. And now that it's placed, I can just go ahead and rotate it. And then go to my camera view and start positioning these together. So very quickly I can go ahead and create my composition, place all the things in perspective, and once I'm happy with it, I'll go ahead and render. And that's going to be the second video after this that will show the composition, the final composition I came up with, and then that generating the render files, which you will see in the image, and which is what I will hand to Scott to do a paint over. And here we are with our final composition. So just like in the previous video, I just arranged all these buildings and scaled them and arranged them to make this final composition. And again, notice here in the timeline I've got a bunch of little tick marks. So I believe these are 3 compositions that I was thinking about, and this one is the one that won, of course. And I've got one here that looks at the entire scene from above. And I've got another one that looks at the specific area where I did a lot of arranging to get everything aligned up and make sure there's no parallels or nothing that is really that I want to show is being seen, and that everything that I don't want to show is not showing. And again, I've got this last one, which is looking at it from the side, where I can also arrange things in this manner. So this is how things are arranged, and again, some of these don't really show up, and this is leaning against the building. That's why one of its legs is up high, and as I zoom in, I can look around my composition and arrange all these different components to finally arrive at this one, which is the final composition, and this is what I'm going to render. Now if I render this in BPR, so if I click on BPR and render this, it's going to render with this basic material, but I really don't want that, even though I want the shadows from it and the ambient occlusion. But I will be talking about how that's possible in a little bit. But before I do that, let me just talk about lights. So the shadow direction and the way the shadows are cast are determined by the lights. So now that I've got my light here, so imagine this scene as a sphere, and this dot here is where the light is. So the light's coming in from the top of the sphere and in the front of the sphere. And so the shadows are going to be casting to the side. And notice here I've got 2 lights, and only one of my lights is casting a shadow. So if I click on this light, which actually is over here, and the intensity of it is pretty low, so it's just kind of a low light to fill some of the areas that this light obstructs. And this is my main light. So notice this light over here does not cast any shadows, but my main light, which is up in this corner, does cast a shadow. So I just want one casting a shadow. In my render, I'm not really going to be getting the shadow, but I'll show you where the shadow pass is that will have the shadow, which will composite in Photoshop, and I'll be showing you my Photoshop scene as well. Okay, so now that we have our composition and the arrangement is exactly the way we want it, all we got to do is render the scene. And to render it, we want to make sure that we're using the preview render, which is the best preview render, BPR. And we want to turn on some BPR filters. So under render properties, we want to make sure shadows and ambient occlusion is on. And for our material, I don't really want a material to show up because this is just going to be a line drawing. So to get that line drawing, I'm going to go ahead and choose flat color. And notice that my screen becomes completely blank. Everything is still there, but everything is painted with a flat white color, so it looks like a blank piece of paper. But that's fine, because when I render it, things will start showing up. So I've got a shadow pass and an ambient occlusion pass. There's some other passes here, but you don't really need them. You just need these two. And ZBrush will automatically generate a mask for you and some other things as well. And then over here under BPR filters is where we're going to go ahead and assign a filter that will do the outline for us. So notice here you've got 12 filters. They're all off. So if the circle next to the number of the filter is filled, it means that filter is off. So as soon as I turn my filter on, and it doesn't matter which one it is, you can choose any one of them. So I'm just going to choose the first one. Click on that, which opens up that circle. So now that filter is on. And from my list of filters here, I will choose colorize, and blend mode is replace, which is the default. And I will choose for the color, I'll choose a black color, because that's what I want my outline color to be. Colorize should be at 100%. Opacity should be at 100%. I think colorize, the default is 50, so lift that up to 100. And then none of these really matter. And if they're different in your settings, change them to match these, which are zeros all the way to the left and ones all the way to the right. And the normal Gaussian is the option here. We don't care about depth. We don't care about anything except cavity. So with cavity, make sure that your cavity is at 1 and your cavity exponent is at 1 as well. Your cavity radius should be 1. That's how thick the line is going to be. And your cavity filter sensitivity, I've got it at about 11.7 here. And you can adjust these after you do your render. So now that we're set all these up, we just click the BPR button and we wait for ZBrush to do the rendering. So while this is going on, you can see here that it shows you the amount of time it's taking and the amount of time it needs to finish. It looks like we've got about half a minute until it's done. And here it's telling you that it's rendering AO and shadows. You might want to turn AO and shadows off initially just to find if you like your render. And once you do, you can turn them on afterwards. So it gets to this point and then it shows us our image, and there it is. So it looks a little bit dotted here because this is a bigger canvas size. So where you set your document size is in here, and the width and the height. So it's bigger than my screen, of course. So if I want to see actually how thick these lines are, if I click on actual, here in my document window and actual, I can see the actual thickness of these lines, which is fine. So I'll go back to my document again and click on zoom to zoom this back out. And again, I can examine this from all different angles. So once this is done, I just go to document and click on export, and that will allow me to export this image as a PSD. Now what happened is when I did this render, I also rendered some passes. So if you click on BPR render passes, here you'll notice that you've got a mask which masks out the buildings from the background. So that's done for you automatically. And this map here is really important, which is the depth map. And this shows you the depth of all these different objects in different shades of gray. And this is really useful in Photoshop, as you will see in my composition in a few minutes. Here are the shadows. So again, you can use this to composite into my image to show where the shadows are. And again, I can render different shadows based on where my light is. And then finally, this is my ambient occlusion. And the settings for the shadow and the ambient occlusion might need some tweaking, and those are done in here. So this is BPR shadow, where you can change some of these variables to get a better shadow result, or BPR AO for ambient occlusion, and you can change these around to get a better AO result. And so once you're done with these and you want them, you can just click on these images here individually, and as you click on them, you can save those individually as PSD files. So in the end, you will have a PSD file for this render. You will have a PSD file for each one of these, right? And you can load those, copy and paste them into one composition, as you will see in a minute. I've done one other thing here, and I'll show that to you real quick, is I've actually turned off the ground planes here that I have. I've got two of them. I've turned them off so I can also see the ground of the floor of the river, and we will see that in the composition in Photoshop as soon as I'm done with ZBrush. So again, this is really a great way to arrange your scene and then render it and then get a line drawing. So this would be kind of an easy way to get it. Your perspective is taken care of, and your composition is taken care of, and you can arrange and rearrange your composition and to your heart's desire. You don't have to be stuck with one composition. And once you are happy with all that, you can just render it, and also you get the depth map, shadow, ambient occlusion, and subsurface scattering. There's one other pass that I've generated in here called a clown pass, which isolates each image, each object into its own color, and that would be easy for me in Photoshop to select that specific object. And to find out how that's done, there is a Ask ZBrush video that you can find. So if you go to YouTube and look for Ask ZBrush and Clown Pass, Joseph Drest has a really good video that shows you how to do that and even generate a macro to do that for you. So with that, we will go into Photoshop and see all these render layers in action. Here in Photoshop, we've got all our images loaded. So this is a simple composition that I did for the magazine as my final render. And again, this is not going to be what we're going to be working on. Scott's going to take the line drawing and all these different layers that we generated and create a composition of his own, but this I just thought I'd spend a few minutes and create a quick composition. And so this is the image that we saw earlier, and I've applied the depth map and some other things to it and some bokeh on the side to get this final composition. But let's see how this is done. So first I'll just turn this off and we'll just look at all our render passes. So this is the clown pass that I was talking about. So what this does is it renders that scene. So it's just another BPR render. And what it does is it renders every single one of these buildings in its own color. And that way I can very easily go to select and select by color range and then pick that specific thing, and I've got the mask for it. So I don't have to go and select the building and laboriously go through all these different teeth and select all the different levels. So again, I just select the color of that building. So again, I mentioned where you can find the tutorial for this, and it's super useful. But outside of this, let's look at all the other renders that I did. So of course the main one is this one right here, which is the outline. So here is the outline render, and as you can see, this is what it looks like, and I can go in and color it. I can put this on a layer and then put a layer underneath it and start painting it in, and then put a layer on top of it and start maybe erasing some of these lines and putting in other objects. And little photo bash components or whatever to create the painting. I'm leaving that up to Scott to do his magic on it. So this is basically the only thing that I would generate usually if I were to do this. But since I get all the other passes, why not use them? So let's look at what those other passes are. We saw the clown pass earlier, and so now we can look at some of these other ones. So this is a specular pass, which basically just adds some specular highlights based on the light that I have. So if some of these objects are going to be shiny, you can just use and know where the specularity is, and you can also composite this image onto your image as well. Here's the mask I talked about, which basically cuts out the sky from all the different objects, so you don't have to mask out the sky. But of course, if I have my clown pass, I can do that as well, because the sky is a different color here. I can mask it out that way. But if I didn't have a clown pass, at least I'd have the mask for the sky, and I can put some clouds back there or a gradient for atmospheric perspective and whatnot. This is the outline pass that I talked about. So this is just a material. So if I didn't want to do the BPR render pass, I could have just used this outline material, and that kind of gives it a little bit of a neat kind of white pattern here. And of course, you can always invert this by hitting Control-I. I need to select it first. And you can also have an outline image this way. I think that the outline image that this generates is not as good as the BPR filter, so that's the one I use by default. This image here is probably one of the most useful images, which is a depth map, which gives you some atmospheric perspective and goes from light, so whatever's closest to you is white and lighter color, and then goes to darker and darker as things get further away. There are buildings here too, and they're in darker grays. You might not be able to see them, but they are there nonetheless. And if you go to image and adjustments, I guess I should be on that layer. If you go to image and adjustments and levels, you can see all the different levels that are here, and of course the darkest colors are in this area and the lightest colors are here. And you could invert this as well, and I'll show you how I used it in my composition. I also generated a contour map, which basically is the skin shade 4 material, and that gives me a little bit better self shadows for the different objects, and also tells me about the contours of the object. And also I generated one of these contours with the shadows and ambient occlusion just to see what it looks like. And again, you can generate as many different passes as you like. This is the ambient occlusion pass that ZBrush generates, and this is the shadow pass, right? So I have all these different passes, and what I've done here is I've composited them. So I've started out with the outline of the river. Outline without the river. So this is basically the same render, but I've hidden the river here, which are basically the two planes that I had. And here is that render with the river, but I've turned that on to less of an opacity, so I could see more of a transparency of that river underneath, right? And then I have a contour that I've added on top of that, and that's set on multiply. And then I've added the shadow, which is also added to multiply. And as you can see, my line drawing is getting some dimension just by adding the shadows. And then I've added the ambient occlusion with a multiply, and that adds a little bit of ambient occlusion, so it creates more definition to the shapes. And here I've taken the outline, the black outline copy, and I've added that as an overlay, and that gives it a bit more of a darker look over here. And then I've basically added a fill layer of orange, and I've added a mask to it, and in the mask I've placed the depth map. So that adds a little bit of atmospheric perspective, like so. This is looking a little bit like Blade Runner 2049. And then I've added another one that gives it more of a color fill, and then another one. I think I actually, in my composition, I had this black outline off, so I'll leave that off. And here I've added another gradient layer to make one side lighter than the other. And this is the area that the light's shining in, just to add some accents. Then I've added a noise layer to add some grain to the background. And then on top of all of this, I've added a copy of the outline to see what it looks like. And then I added a specular on top of that to add those little specular highlights, but I have that at pretty low level. So this was my final comp right here, right? And then I added some bokeh to it, and that just blurred the sides a bit to give it even more dimension. So again, all of these passes are there for you, and Scott will take this render and take these passes and generate his own version of the scene using these elements as a skeleton and doing a paint over. So with that, on to part number 2 in hopefully the next issue or in a follow-up issue to this one. Thank you.